All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Hopefully, you all can see and hear me very well. My name is Paul Buffa, and today I'm going to be talking about D3 in our Introduction to D3 course. I'm so excited to be here. I've been a D3 developer for many years. I've taught many D3 classes, so really excited to walk through all this with you today. So, just let me know if in the chat here if you can hear and see me well before we get started. So make sure there's no technical issues, because that can make it pretty difficult to teach if you can't hear and see me. All right, let's see. Yes, I think I'm getting some yeses. All good. It's perfect. All right, so Introduction to D3 course. So today I have a few people here with me, and let's move my avatar so you can actually see them. We'll scoot this up a bit. There we go. A little video magic. All right. So my name is Paul Buffa. I'm the head of product education at Observable, and I'll be teaching the course for the next few days. So really excited again. I have two other coworkers with me, Allison and Wayne, who will be helping TA the course. So thank you two for helping out. A few logistics before we jump into all the content, which there's a lot. So we want to really jump in today. You can ask questions in the chat throughout the course, so feel free to do that. And please do that. I really want to make sure that we get to your specific questions and make sure this course is really helpful for you. So at any point, feel free to post a question there. I may not be checking it as regularly. Alice and Wayne will kind of flag questions for me, so I might get to it in a little bit. But please post questions there. We also have a community Slack channel that you may already be in. I think there's about 100 people in there already. So if you want to join that, that's a great place to ask kind of longer form questions. So if you've got more specific questions, something that's hard to put into a chat message here, then the community Slack channel is the best place for that. So please check that out. We are going to be doing a lot of our work in Observable. Since we work at Observable, we love using Observable. We'll be doing a lot of the workshops sections of the course in Observable. So if you don't have an account yet, I would sign up now and make sure you have that all set, because we're going to ask you to fork a copy of our notebook, make a copy in your own workspace, so you can save your work. I suggest having, if you can, sometimes it's hard depending on your monitor or screen situation, to have two screens side by side. So if you can do that, if you've got enough width in your monitor or your screen to kind of have this window open and maybe the notebook open that I'm going to be going through, that'd be great. That'd be ideal. But it's also fun if you just want to kind of follow and just watch along. You don't have to necessarily code at the same time. After session 5, there'll be an assignment. So if you want to get kind of a course certificate for this Introduction to D3 course, you have to complete that assignment. So we'll give you a few weeks, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the end of session 5 around what the course assignment is and what we're looking for here. So hopefully many of you had received the email or saw in the course description that there are some prerequisites we really recommend for this course. D3 can be fairly difficult to learn. If you've ever jumped into it before, there's a lot of topics that get involved with D3. So we have a little bit of Observable we're covering in this class, so there's a little prerequisite for that. But JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, these are all kind of integral parts of working with D3. And the more you know about these different languages, the better you'll be at building in D3. So we sent some links before for getting started, some real 101 level courses on these different topics. So please check those out if you haven't already. And obviously, if you are already a web developer or know a little bit about these different topics, you should be pretty good for this class. And it's totally fine to be beginner level. Do not need to be an expert in this stuff, but you do want to know a little bit to get more out of the course. So here is the agenda for today. We got a lot of stuff to go through, so I'm going to jump right into it. We're going to talk about what is D3, a little bit about Observable. We're going to do a very quick pass of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We're going to talk about the SVG and the DOM, and then we're going to do a little bit of D3 today. So we are actually going to start jumping into the framework and start using it. So just kind of high level before I even jump into this, my goal for this course is that each of you kind of walk away being able to understand, how D3 works and be able to read D3 code. It can be difficult to write D3 from scratch and just, off the top of your head, be able to spout out all the different D3 functions. And sorry, my cat's meowing here, so I'm going to pick her up. So what I want you to be able to do from this class is when you find a D3 example, is be able to read through it and generally understand how it all works. And enough so that you can start changing the code to make it work for your own use case. So you may not be able to memorize everything. That's not going to be the expectations from this course. But if you see a block of D3 code, you can generally go, oh yeah, I get what's going on here. I know this is where they're making marks and this is where they're setting scales. And if I need to adjust, this is what I have to do. All right, so if there's no initial questions, let's jump right into it. So maybe it'd be helpful to talk about what is D3. Hopefully you've got a little bit of knowledge about this, given you signed up for the course, you had some interest in the topic, but what is D3? So it's always kind of fun to start off like, what does D3 even stand for? Like, what does D3 mean? Does anybody know and want to put in the chat here? Let's see. I think there's always like a little delay, so maybe I'll jump right in so I don't have to wait too long here. But all right, D3. 3 Ds, right? Okay, so what does that stand for? The first part, data. Okay. Second part, driven. And there we go. We got an answer there by Saul. And the last part is documents. Yes, data-driven documents. So what does that mean? Data-driven documents, where documents refers to the document object model, the DOM standard, that represents the content of a web page. Okay, so what we're saying here is that web pages are built out of documents, right? So when you're going to a website, you're actually viewing a document, really. So if you inspect the code for a website, you're just going to find a document there. And often it's going to be an HTML document, right? And you can go through that and see how the whole thing is built. And the browser is basically going to render that document. It's going to understand what that document's code means and show it to you in this visual way. And what D3 is, it's a way to have data drive the creation of documents. So what's been interesting there, as I say that, is that it's not actually talking about visualization, right? There's nothing that says like D3 is a data visualization library. It says D3 is about data-driven documents. So it's not really a charting library in the traditional sense, where many libraries you might use, there's just a function for scatterplot or a function for line chart. It has no concepts of charts in D3. When you visualize with D3, you compose a variety of primitives. So what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at some D3 code and see if we can understand what that means. So here is a really simple visualization of a scatter plot. We'll be walking through this example more today and tomorrow's session. We're actually going to recreate this chart. So here's all the code for generating that D3 scatter plot. I understand this might be too hard for you to read, so it's a little, it's pretty big. There's a lot of code here, right? There's probably 50 lines of code or something like that. But one thing you might just notice off the bat is that there's nothing in here that is like scatter plot function, right? It's just a bunch of code. So what is the code here? Let's walk through it a little bit. So the first part of the code here is where we define the chart's dimensions. We define the width, the height, margins, which we'll get into more tomorrow. Then we start defining scales. So a scale for the x-axis, a scale for the y-axis. So how we convert our data into pixels so we can make that embedding of our data in the visualization. Then we can create a container, the medium in which we're actually going to view the visualization, which is an SVG container. Then we start specifying other subcontainers. We create our axes. So we had created our scales before. Now we're actually going to create the axes for our visualization. And then lastly, we create all the circles for the scatter plot, right? So we define the styling of the circles, the stroke width, and where the circles are placed, the X and Y coordinates, the radius of the circles. So really kind of like everything, right? Nothing came out of the box for us. We had to really specify every part of our visualization. So the canvas that we're looking at, the scales that we're using, the axes that we see, the points that we see, all of that, we had to write code to make sure that that was on the page. Nothing just came out of the box. So that's why we say like D3 is not really a charting library per se, because it's not just giving us a function that generates the whole visualization for us. It gives us the components that we need to create that visualization. So why would you use D3? That sounds like a lot of work, right? To make a pretty simple chart form. Well, with that that complexity, right? We get a lot back in return. So what we can do with D3 is build fully customizable novel chart forms or bespoke visualizations. It's one reason why you see it often used by editorial groups like the New York Times or the Washington Post to build these really complicated, sophisticated visualization forms. It's also really good at handling things like animation, interaction, and dynamic visualizations. Things that it's really hard to do with other charting libraries. You can build out with D3. So it's one reason why it's so popular. You can build stuff you just can't build anywhere else, right? So real quick, let's just go through a fun like couple examples of like where it actually makes sense to use D3. So here's a visualization. Actually, I'm going to go to the notebook for it. It's for an animated tree map. And hopefully this renders pretty well. It's a little big on the page. Try to center it. So what here we're doing, it's a tree map visualization. So if you're not familiar with tree maps, right, this is a more complicated chart form. Think of it in some ways like a stacked bar chart, but instead of being stacked just kind of along one axis, maybe along the x-axis or the y-axis, it's stacked in both dimensions, right? So it's trying to pack all these different rectangles inside one, so here it's going to be one square. And the breakdowns, the subdivisions, are showing the population size by states over time. So it starts off with the population size of states in America from 1790. And if I play this button here, you're going to see it animate. And you're going to see how it grows year to year. And this is something you just can't do with other charting libraries, right? Being able to create this kind of novel chart form could be hard for many charting libraries, but be able to handle this sort of animation and be able to kind of guide it in the way that it changes over time is very hard to do with other libraries. And it's where D3 really thrives. And it's a pretty fun one because you can see just how much things change over time, right? You know, there's certain sections that are colored by their regions, and you can see just kind of how the mix of population size across states has varied over the last 250, years or so. Gonna let it just complete here because it's always kind of fun. California gets so much bigger. Off the charts. All right. What's another fun example? And we're just going to do a few here. There's countless fun examples of D3 that you can find. So this is one I've always really enjoyed by, award-winning D3 developer, Nati Bremer, just a data visualization developer who uses a lot of D3. She's got so many incredible examples. This is one that she did for Google, trying to visualize searches about cats and dogs. So this is the one for dogs and showing kind of like what people search and what are those sort of progression of searches. Like what are the different structures of searches people do when they search about dogs. So like, why do dogs bark at cats? Here's one. And you'll see here, this is like a really complicated visualization, right? It's a circle packing visualization where the size of the circles indicates how often that search term is used. The name here was Nati Bremer, and we can maybe share a link in the chat here. The size of the circles show how often that search term is used. And then within this circle packing, there's a network graph with also circles showing how often that search term is used. Like a really complicated data set that'd be really hard to visualize with like a bar chart, right? I don't know how you could exactly do this in the bar chart. Probably, maybe you could do it, but just wouldn't be as fun. But it works really well in this sort of form here. Really interactive. There's some cool styling too to give this sort of like hand-drawn sort of feeling to it. And you can just kind of hover on these different things and learn about it. And if you actually click on it, it'll bring a link to what that search result is. Thank you. Yeah, her website, Visual Cinnamon, is really good. So hopefully you got a little sense of like what D3 is about, what it is and what it's not, and why you might use it. Let's jump into now Observable, because we're going to do a lot of working in an Observable notebook for this course. So let's just cover the basics here. Again, if you hopefully have done the prerequisites, it's fairly familiar to you, but in case you haven't, just enough so you can kind of have a vague understanding of what's going on, maybe not necessarily a thorough understanding. So why do we teach in Observable? What's great about that? Well, when you're teaching D3, you often need a lot of different software and applications to get things up and running. So, you would need a text editor to work with. You might need to have Python installed to be able to run a local server. So one thing that's great about using Observable is that we don't have to do any of that. We can just go right into building our D3 code. We don't have to worry about a text editor or starting servers. All of that is available to you. So that's one reason why I love using Observable. All right, so we're going to jump into our first activity. Now, if Allison or Wayne could share the link here, we've got a notebook we're going to be using for many of the activities in this course, and this is the one for today's session. There's a link to the slide deck as well if you want to check that out. And for this, we're really going to want you to fork the notebook. So we've got a good number of people here today, just so we don't have any issues of all of us forking at the exact same time. Let's say if you've got an account, you're ready to fork, everyone who it's currently in the evening right now, why don't you fork this notebook? And then we'll go kind of across the world. And we've got a lot of people in different parts of the world. I believe you have a whole cohort of students from a class in, I think it was DIS Stockholm, who's checking out the course today. So thank you so much for joining. I know it's late there and you could be partying, but you're learning all about D3, which I would argue is maybe more fun. So why don't you fork the notebook now? In a minute, we'll maybe move over to the Americas where they can then fork the notebook, kind of just not do it all at the exact same time. All right, so let me just do a quick walkthrough of what we're talking about with Observable. So an Observable notebook, what is that? Again, in case you've not done any of the prerequisites, you've just shown up having no idea what Observable is. So an Observable notebook, it's going to be very similar to other notebook tools you've probably used before. A notebook in Observable is where we do our analysis, where we add our data sets, where we run our code. It is really where we do all of our work in Observable. And the way we do that is we add cells to our notebook to run that analysis. And Observable is all about JavaScript, which works great with D3 because D3 is a JavaScript framework. So when we're using Observable, we're going to see a lot of JavaScript cells we add to our analysis. We're also going to have things like HTML cells. Later in the course, we'll get into more different types of data type cells for handling data sets. But we're going to be doing a lot of JavaScript work. And when we want to add a cell to our notebook, we're going to simply click on this little plus icon here. And my apologies, I was trying to figure out how to get this to work right. It didn't work great, so I decided to not do it today, but you can't see my cursor. So hopefully you can see when I hover over something, the color kind of changes. So you can see that little plus icon turns blue when I hover over it. But if I click on that, I'm going to get this add cell menu, which allows me to add cells to my notebook. And you can see all the different types of cells that are available to here. You can also search for cells. So if you want to search for like an HTML cell, you could find HTML cells as well. Okay, I said before, for anyone that's currently in the evening, fork this notebook. All right, anyone now in the Americas, why don't you fork this notebook as well, so we can get started. And lastly, we do for anybody, it's in the I guess it's, I don't know what time of day would be. I guess it'd be really, really late at night or really, really early in the morning. So our first part of this workshop, we're going to just do a little Observable setup. So I said before, sign in or sign up. We're going to fork this notebook. So what is forking a notebook? Well, if I go to the top of the page here, you're going to see this little icon. You won't see the share one since you don't own this notebook. So it's only available for you if you are an editor of this notebook. But we're going to click on this little fork button here. So allow you to fork this notebook and get up and running. You're actually going to be forking the original copy. I'm using a fork of the original copy right now. So when you click on this button, it'll allow you to fork the notebook in your own workspace. This way you have your own copy of it. And when you make changes, that's only for you, right? So if you are in this notebook right now, you'll see me as I make changes, which is pretty cool. You can see me make live changes. But if you fork it, you'll be in your own copy. So I won't be making edits or changes to that notebook. Now, when we have a cell in an Observable notebook, we can write code in it, right? So I've got an HTML cell here where I've got some really sophisticated code, a little p tag, a paragraph tag, and I wrote hello world. And if I change the code here by maybe adding a couple more exclamation points to make it even better, I can run this cell to change the output. So you can see the output of the cell is above, right? And I can run this to change it. So if I click on this little play icon over here, to run the cell, you'll see now the number of exclamation points has gotten even better. Now, one thing I'll do a lot in this course is use a keyboard shortcut for running a cell. I don't use a ton of keyboard shortcuts, but this is one that I absolutely use constantly. So it's good for you to know. So if you want to run a cell, so I'll go back to just one exclamation point, a little less exciting. If I want to run a cell, I can just hit Shift Enter, Shift Return, and it'll run that cell for me. So I don't have to click on that little play icon, which can be a bit tedious if you're writing code to have to use your mouse and kind of click on that. So when I'm writing code, I have the code available underneath the output of the cell. If I want, I can hide that. So if I click on this little pin icon to the left of the cell and then move away, it'll close the cell for me, or I can click on that little arrow that opens up or closes. So that's one way you can hide cells. You can delete cells with the little trash can icon there. There's also the cell toolbar at the bottom of the page, which you'll be able to see. Let me just make sure. Oh, I might be actually getting cut off of my screen share here. So, if you're in the notebook, you'll notice there's a few of these options at the bottom of the page as well. So there's a few different places where you can make these changes. You can also duplicate cells. So in that little, next to the trash icon, there's a little plus icon there, and that'll allow you to make a copy of a cell. So you can have two of them, and then you can make changes to one that doesn't affect the other. But let's talk a little bit about how cells kind of work with each other. So I'm going to create a JavaScript cell here. Just clicked on that JavaScript button underneath. And I'm going to write one where a is equal to 10. So I'm creating a variable that called a, and it's equal to the value of 10. Now, in other notebook platforms, you're going to do the same thing where you can create variables in a cell and use them in other cells. So if I create a new JavaScript cell, I can do a times 2, and that's going to create the output of 20. Since a is equal to 10, then I can do a times 2 to create 20. I can also create new variables that are built off of other variables. So I can create the variable b, which is equal to a times 2. So now I've got a and b. So now I've kind of created this dependency, right, across cells. So one cell is using the output of another cell. I can look at this visually using one of the panes on the right side of the page. So you notice there's all these icons here. Again, you can't see my cursor, but you can see hopefully when I'm hovering over. There's one here underneath the little clock icon called the mini-map pane. And if I click on that, I can see the relationships between cells in my notebook. So it'll default show me the one that I'm currently inspecting. So the value of b is equal to a times 2. And you can see that it's dependent on the value of a. Now, there's lots of features in Observable. I'm highlighting this one in particular because when working with D3 code in this course, we might often have multiple cells that are kind of using each other's values. So it's really good to be able to see kind of how that works, because sometimes if you've got complicated D3 code, it can be hard to figure out exactly where are all the dependencies from my code and how is that working. So you can use the mini-map pane for figuring that out and can be really, really helpful. And you'll notice here is kind of a visual lexicon, right? So there's a visual sort of vocabulary for understanding these dependencies. So when you're on a particular cell, like B here, you'll notice that there's this little icon to show the dependencies, and it's kind of going up and to the left, which means it's dependent on other values. And when you click on this one, when I click on the value of A, it kind of shifts over, right? So it's going down to the right. I mean, there's other values, other cells that are using the value of A. So just a little bit there, and then get more and more complicated, right? You can have dependencies on dependencies on dependencies. You can build these big trees. We probably won't do too much of that in this course, but it's just, again, maybe good to know. So that's like the lightning fast version of how Observable works. If you, again, are like completely new to Observable, have never used it before, I'd really recommend checking out this tutorial we have called A Taste of Observable. Kind of walks through the main concepts and how to use it. It's all hands-on, so it's pretty fun to do. It only takes a few minutes, so definitely worth checking out if you haven't already. All right, so let's go back to our slides. We've got so much content. We're going to keep moving along. So we're going to talk real high-level HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So these are sort of the core technologies we're going to use when we're building D3 visualizations. And I mentioned before, the more you know about them, the more you'll be able to do with D3. So it's really helpful to, again, have at least a basic familiarity with each of these different languages so you can understand them, maybe not know every single function or tag or call, but just be able to know basically how it works and what we're dealing with here. And we'll cover it just kind of real fast. So again, not in any quick depth, and not in any depth we'll be covering these topics, but just doing a quick pass. So what is HTML? Well, that's the standard markup language for documents on the web. If you look at the code rendered on the page, which you can do for any website. So if you go to the JavaScript console, you can see the elements on the page. You'll see it's just all HTML at the end of the day. So when we're writing code, we're writing apps, what we're basically generating is HTML that then the browser is going to render for us. So if you are building a React app, right, or a Svelte app, you're basically going to generate a bunch of HTML that then is easily rendered by the browser. So CSS then? CSS is a markup language, similar to HTML, for styling these different elements on the page. So like adding colors, strokes, and fonts. So, if we've got an HTML tag for some text and we want to change the color of that text to a different color, we're going to use some CSS for that. And again, so we're going to use this a lot with D3, given that often with D3, we're going to want to style our visualization. We want to change the color of the strokes, of the circles, of lots of different things, of the rectangles. So we're going to use a lot of CSS for that. Finally, JavaScript, the programming language for the web. So it's a programming language that was made for web development, and D3 is a JavaScript framework. So we're going to be doing a lot of JavaScript in this course. And again, the more JavaScript you know, the better you'll be at D3. So we'll just cover a couple facts for each of these different languages that are good to kind of keep in mind, again, if you're kind of new to it. So when working with HTML with D3, we're often going to be using the SVG tag for working with SVG in HTML. We're in this course going to be talking exclusively about D3 visualizations with SVG. There's other ways you can build D3 visualizations that don't involve SVG, but we will not be covering that in that course because that's a more advanced topic and a fairly different way of writing D3. We often use HTML tags for selecting and inserting our visualizations. So we might start off by selecting or inspecting, a div tag and inserting an SVG into that tag. So we're kind of controlling the DOM, we're controlling the HTML code here. And in Observable, we have methods for writing HTML and JavaScript. So that's going to work really well for using it in notebooks. It's a little different if you were taking a course that was not using Observable. You would just kind of be writing an HTML document and then adding maybe like a script tag in there for writing JavaScript. But in Observable, we're going to be writing a little HTML in JavaScript. So it's really easy to kind of do the two in conjunction. So a couple of CSS facts to know for D3. As I mentioned before, CSS is going to work for styling or HTML and SVG. And one of the most important things to know about CSS when working with D3 is that you're going to be using CSS selectors, or this idea of selectors, to grab different elements in D3. So it's going to be the same way that you specify how to style something with CSS as how you select something with D3. Some JavaScript facts to know for D3. So as I mentioned before, D3 is a JavaScript framework. And while you can do most of your work without having to write vanilla JavaScript, a lot of it's going to be specific to the D3 framework. The more knowledge of JavaScript you have, the more you'll be able to do with D3. So definitely worth, spending a little time learning more about JavaScript if you can. We're also often going to use this immediately invoked function expressions, so IIFE with D3. It's this idea of kind of writing functions on the fly that are immediately invoked. So it means they're immediately run when writing your D3 code. You're going to see this a lot when we're writing D3 examples. So it's kind of good to have a vague understanding of what that is. And we'll walk through that in more detail, what that looks like in just a few minutes with our next activity. All right, so why don't we jump into that? I forgot to pause before just to see if there's any questions before the first workshop of today, so apologies for that. I usually try to pause after each activity. So why don't we just quickly see through as any questions on the observable questions here. Let's see. Looks like we have one around, can you export from observable after creating something? Absolutely. So here was the question. Yes, so when you work in Observable, you can export your visualizations as images. You can export the code if you like. So there's lots of different ways to get your work into another application if you like with Observable. So for an image, on the icon here, this little cell options, there'll be an option to download as an SVG or PNG. So let me just actually just show what that is real quick. I'll pull the bar chart here. This is using a different visualization framework called Observable Plot, which we'll be teaching a course on in just a couple of weeks. So you can also check that out. So for when you have a visualization in a cell, you can have the option to download SVG or PNG, so you can easily get that code. And if you have a name cell, so if you call this cell something, you can also embed this using iframes. And depending on the type of account you have more options for doing like a private iframe. You can also download the code as JavaScript or React if you want to do it that way too. So lots of different options for getting your work out of Observable. Great question. And let me see if there's any more here. Okay, looks like lots of woot woots. That's great. Hopefully everyone is following along pretty well. I know we're moving at a lightning pace today, so feel free again to ask a question if there's anything I'm kind of going through maybe a little too fast here. All right, so writing HTML and CSS. We're going to do a little activity on this, so we kind of understand again the basics here. So I've got a little bit of CSL. Sorry, CSL. That's a weird combination of HTML and CSS. I've got a little bit of HTML here that we're going to start editing and playing with. So this one says HTML is neat, and it's got a bunch of different tags in here. So right, this is our HTML. We're using kind of a markup language. We're defining different tags, like a div tag for a container, an h1 tag for a header, a p tag for a paragraph, right? And tags are nested within other tags. And again, hopefully you've got some familiarity with this. So you can see there's sort of this parent container of a div tag, and within that, there's other ones. So there's an h1 there, a p tag. There's another div tag, right? This is often how you're going to see pages are structured. It has sort of this hierarchical structure to it, right? Where you've got maybe like a parent tag. So here we've got this div tag, and everything else is kind of stored within that div tag, right? There's lots of reasons for why doing that, and I'm not going to walk through all of that today, but it's something you're going to see in most websites, very, very common. Here we've got, a list tag and list items in there. So that's how you get those little dots, right, alongside each item, where it says HTML is fun, cool, and old. It is not a new language, right? It's been around for a long time now. So why don't we just start editing this code a bit so we can understand how it works a little bit. We're gonna maybe start off by adding a div tag. So we're gonna add a div tag to this code with a nested p tag, okay, like we have right there. And it's going to tend. Oh, sorry, I actually already did this. I forgot I edited it before. Okay, let me delete it. I'll walk through it again. So we're going to add a div tag. Here we go. And within there, we're going to write a little bit of text. So we're going to add another p tag and say, "Whoa, I'm writing HTML." When I run that, it's going to change the output of the cell. And I can add again more exclamation points. You can see it is in fact changing the output there. So what you're going to see often with HTML is that you've got your HTML code below, and then above you might have some CSS, right, for defining styles. Now, for larger websites, usually you kind of import this CSS rather than having it literally all in the same document, because they may make it really, really big document. But here we're just going to write in the same spot, so it's really simple. So here we can write some styling for our HTML code. And what you do for CSS, and again, you should hopefully know a little bit about this from the prerequisites, is you're going to say what tag we're going to use, or how are we going to select what we're going to style. So you can do it by writing tags. You can do it by specifying a class or an ID. So first we'll start off very simply by specifying maybe a div tag, and we're going to change the color of our text to red. And well, what's pretty cool here is you'll notice that it actually changed the color red for everything on the page for the most part. It doesn't do that for H tags, H1 tags, or H2 tags. So yeah, it actually kind of read the entire page and changed the style for it. And it definitely changed all the text for the div tags in this little block of code here. So maybe I want to make that more specific, which sort of tags I'm specifying here. I've got this div tag with a class called myDiv, so I can use that class to specify what I'm changing the style of. So for a class in CSS, we're going to use a period to denote that we're looking at a class. And then I'll just put in my div. And now there we go. If I rerun this, now only the contents within my class, the class my div, are going to have the color change to red for the font color. I can change this to blue. I can change it to whatever I like, right? I can add a bunch of different specifications here for more styling, but really, really basic. Another thing I just want to cover quickly is that if I want to, say, select a specific tag within this, I can write multiple tags after each other in CSS. So if I do my div, I'm just going to copy and paste that. And maybe I want to grab just this h1 tag right there. I could then, right after my div, after a space, write h1, and that'll say, okay, within my div, that class, look for the tag h1. And for that, I'm going to change the font size to, let's make it 60 pixels. There we go. Now I've made HTML is neat, much, much larger. So again, very high level covering of HTML and CSS, but it's good to know because this way that we select different elements on the page with CSS using selectors, it's going to be the same way that we do with D3, which we're going to walk through in the last part of the workshop today. So below here, I also just have a little bit about how you can write HTML in a JavaScript cell. So all you're going to have to do is call this library called HTML, and then you can write HTML within a backtick here. So this is another way that you can write HTML in a JavaScript cell in Observable. And we're often going to do this kind of instantiate our HTML for D3. So we might just create a div tag with HTML using this method, and then we're going to start selecting that and making changes to it. So something you're going to see pretty often, but essentially it's the same way. Actually, this one doesn't have a closed p tag. I should probably add that in there. Go. But that is the lightning fast cover of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for this course. And after this, we're really going to be talking almost exclusively about D3. I'm sorry, actually, we have another activity below about JavaScript. Let me just take a look at the questions here. So one question, when using Observable, can we also work locally on our machine instead of only online? So you can download all the code from your notebook and just run that locally if you like. So that's an option to you at the top of the page here. If I go to these options, there's an export option. We can download all of that code. So we can do that and download all the code and make changes locally and do everything locally if we like. Again, with the embed options, you can also download your code. And then when your code updates in Observable, it'll also update locally. If you do it this way of just downloading your code, it'll just download a zip file with all the code there. And then if you make changes to your notebook, it won't make it locally. And it's also a one-way direction, right? So if I download code or if I embed code locally, I can get it from Observable, but it's not going to push it back up to Observable. We don't support that. So typically, we do most of our work in Observable. And then if we need to present it in another method, we might download our code to show it that way. Great question, though. Okay, and there's another question here. Why is the color of the H1 and H3 not red? They are part of the div. Yeah, H tags for headers, they've got kind of special styling there. That's a little bit different than it works for a div or a p tag. So there's some different changes you'd have to make there. But it's just because of the tag type. All right, great. So let's jump down to this little JavaScript exercise we're going to do. So that was about HTML and CSS. And then we're going to do just a quick pass of JavaScript. So again, hopefully you've got some familiarity. You know a little bit about JavaScript. So this is going to be a pretty quick walkthrough. So again, as I mentioned before, we can write JavaScript in a JavaScript cell in an Observable notebook. So why don't we start off by doing a simple exercise of creating an array. So that's a type of object in JavaScript that allows us to work with often data sets. So I'm going to create this array by specifying the array, creating 2 brackets, and then filling the contents with 1, 2, 3, 4. So if I run this, you'll see it's an array of 4 items. I can inspect that. I can open it up, and I can see the values are 1, 2, 3, 4. You notice to the left here, it's showing me the index for each of these items, and indexes in JavaScript start at 0. So for 1, the index value is 0. So it's actually just kind of 1 less than the value here. So when working with arrays, we have a lot of methods available to us. And this is going to be something you often see for data sets. That's why we talk a lot about arrays when working with D3, because most data sets we work with are going to be an array of objects. That's sort of the JavaScript equivalent of a spreadsheet. So for this array, we're going to use a map method to alter the array, to change the output of the array. And we're going to do that by specifying .map. So we're going to call this method on this array. And when I type this in, you'll see I get some little description here in Observable of what the map method does and how it works. So what we're going to do is use that method I talked about before, the immediately invoked function expressions, for calling a function within this map method. So I'm going to do that by specifying d, and the arrow symbol, and I'll do d times 2. Again, I understand that this is, again, if you're completely new to JavaScript, you may not understand exactly what's going on here, and I really recommend checking out those prerequisites. This is something you're going to see often when working with D3. So what's going on here? Okay, so when I call this map method, I'm creating a function in here, right? And this function is telling me what I'm going to do using the map method. What a map method does, it's going to go through each item in the array and run this function for that item. So when I ran map here, and I did d arrow d times 2, that means I'm going to multiply 2 by the value in that array. So d here is referring to the value in that array, right? And I can call this anything. It's just kind of standard convention to often call this d to represent the data, but I can call this banana, and I could have banana times 2, and it's going to be the exact same thing here, right? Or banana times 3. So you can do this any way you like, but again, typically it's going to be d. Now, I could also write this in a different way. An older method would be write function here, and instead of using the arrow operator, I'm going to be just returning it in braces. And I could say return d times 3. That's the exact same thing, the exact same output. That's kind of the older method of writing JavaScript. We're going to be using the more modern method of arrow functions. And then there we go. Now it's going to do the exact same thing here. We also get other items in this function, the other parameters, for free. So we get the data for free. We also get the index for free. So again, standard convention is use I to represent the index. And I can say I times 3 if I want to use the index rather than the data value. And again, since the index starts at 0, I times 3 for the first one here will be equal to 0 because it's 0 times 3. And then for 1, it'll be 3, 2, etc. So again, hopefully you've done a little bit of this before. This is familiar to you. And if not, you're kind of generally understanding how this works. So map is a method we can use for arrays. We can also use a filter. So I'll just change this back to d. I'll make it d times 2. 4. So I can chain these methods, right? I can declare a map method, and right after that, declare a filter method, which is also going to work for my array. And I'm going to do the same thing as before. I'm going to use the value of d, and I'm going to say filter this array where d has to be greater than 2. Now, if I run this, my array just got smaller. It went from being an array of 4 elements to an array of 3, right? So I've got only the values of 4, 6, and 8 because the first value was 2 and d is and then not greater than 2. So we filtered that out from the results. I could also just say where d is, say, equal to 2. Notice I'm using a double equal sign there. I can also use 3. So a double just makes sure that the value is equivalent, no matter what the type of value it is. While 3 would check also the type. Again, I can't cover all the JavaScript basics here, so I would definitely check out this tutorial if you haven't already, just to cover those if this is all brand new to you. But there's a lot of the methods that we'll be using with D3. So one question here, I'm going to cover this one, is why is it only possible to declare one variable per cell? Yeah, so this is the way that notebooks sort of work here, is that each cell is a code block. So within a cell, we could actually run a bunch of different variables if we want. So I can just add these curly braces here to define that I'm working in a code block. I could then return this here. And within there, I could have a bunch of different variables. So I could have const my array, is equal to that 1, 2, 3, 4. Use that. So this is how we're often going to write D3 code inside this code block. At the end, though, the cell is returning one variable. So this could be called my cell array. And that's the only thing returns at the end of the day. And this is how cells kind of work with each other, right? We're going to have a cell return a variable, then another cell can use the output of that variable, but we're not defining multiple for the output of each cell. Within a cell, you could have this code block that runs many different variables and does a lot of work with them. But we're always going to return one variable for the code. All right. Being conscious of time. Again, this is a jam-packed first session because this is kind of a lot to cover. Let's get into SVG and the DOM. So I mentioned before a little bit about SVG is what we're going to be using in this course, and you're often going to see for data D3 examples. So what is SVG? SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. So it's a way of generating images that's different than kind of the more, I guess, traditional or classic method where you basically specify each pixel, right? Specify what the value is for each pixel in that image, and then that's how you generate the image. So that's called like a raster method, which you're going to see for GIFs or JPEGs or PNGs. And why would we use SVG versus those methods? Well, if I zoom in, the idea with an SVG is that it's going to then, since it's using code, it can scale very well. Since it's a scalable vector graphic, when you zoom into an SVG, you're still going to see a really clear graphic, while for a raster, it's going to get really pixelated. So this is often what we use for D3. It works really well for the web. It works well with HTML. And again, one of the biggest reasons, again, is how it scales. This is a little bit of SVG code, so you can understand what it looks like. So it's similar to HTML, but it's got its own kind of specific tags that are particular to SVG. So with SVG, we get a lot of tags around creating visuals for images, for shapes. So here we've got one SVG that just has a few different circles. So there's the circle tags, and they have their own specific attributes, right? So for a circle tag, we have to give it a radius value to say how large the circle is. So they're going to find the size of the circle based on the radius. We also give it a CX and a CY. That stands for the circle's X coordinates and the circle's Y coordinates. And that'll be the center of the circle there. So you'll see for the first one, the radius is 10. The next one, the radius is 5. And the last one, the radius is 20. They have different coordinates, which makes it kind of go along this diagonal here. So SVG is to graphics what HTML is to text. It's a markup language for defining graphics. There are specific tags, again, to SVG. They're not going to work in HTML. So like you need to define it within an SVG tag for it to work. So a circle is specific to SVG, not necessarily to HTML. And like HTML with SVG, we're creating a hierarchy of elements that can be both viewed as the DOM. So it's going to be very similar to what we covered before. I like to, for this, kind of look at a visualization and talk a little bit about how it's structured in terms of the SVG in this sort of DOM model. So DOM stands for the Document Object Model. We talked about this a little bit before, and it's the data representation of elements on the page. So let's look at this line chart here. If we looked at this in sort of the DOM structure of this line chart, it would look something like this. So I've kind of visualized this as a tree diagram. And the way that line chart is structured is you've got this sort of parent SVG, which is the canvas that we're doing all of this visualization on. And within that, there's a bunch of group tags. You can think of this sort of like div containers, their way of containing multiple elements together. And then within those, we have the different elements that actually create the visualization. So there's a bunch of path elements. These are used to make often little lines that are for the axes labels. We have text elements, and that's going to be for those axes. And then we're going to have like this one path that actually generates the entire line. So when I go back to this visualization here, I see this line. This is actually a representation of Apple stock over time. That is all one SVG path object that's creating that. So if I go here, I can see all those. For the sake of time, I'm actually going to skip the next activity. We've only got 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure we have enough time to cover the last activity. But if you go to that notebook, there's a fun little interactive section here where you can change the drop down of a visualization to see different types of visualizations, and you can see how it impacts the DOM. So it'll show you this sort of tree, and when you change values in those drop downs, you can then see how it changes the DOM. So you can see how that structure changes. Oh, I see there's a question here. Will these sessions be available to watch again afterwards? And yes, we're going to have these all saved so you can go through these in more depth if you'd like to on YouTube. They'll be all saved to our YouTube channel. All right, so in the last few minutes here, I want to spend a little time just doing some D3 first steps. Since there's a lot of prerequisites for D3, it's hard to jump right into it. We have to cover a little bit of the different languages and technology and frameworks that go into D3, but we will get a little time of D3 today, and then the rest of this course is going to just be D3 the whole time. So D3 first steps. Again, D3 is a JavaScript framework, right? So we're using JavaScript here for calling D3. And there's a few specific functions and parameters and settings we're going to be talking about as kind of our D3 first steps. The most important one is the D3 select and D3 select all. So D3 select, this is how we grab an element on the page using selectors like we did before with CSS. And that allows us to start working with D3. We have to grab something on the page or generate something on the page, and then we can start, binding data to it, creating attributes and properties based off that data, but we need something to work with on the page to start building our D3. So D3 select is how we grab a single object, and D3 select all is going to select all the elements that match that logic. So if we want to select, say, one div tag, we use D3 select. If we did D3 select all, we could select all the div tags on the page. .data is going to how we're going to bind data to a selection. So it's going to allow us to take data sets and actually set it to this element on the page so we can use it for our different visualization work. And .style and .attributes is how we set styles and attributes, often using that data. So to explain this a little bit better, let's just jump right into the activity. We can show you how this works. So if I go back to my notebook here, and I go to the bottom of the page, again, that was that little drop down I was mentioning before where you could change settings here, and then you can see how it updates that sort of DOM tree on the page. So here we are, we've got D3 first steps. So I've got here a little bit of JavaScript code that's using that method for creating HTML and JavaScript I mentioned before. So this HTML, it's got a div tag, and within there are 3 paragraph tags. And we can see all of those rendered above the cell here. So the output of that cell is showing me those 3 paragraph tags. First paragraph, second paragraph, and third paragraph. And what we're going to do is we're going to start using some D3 to alter those paragraphs. Yes, question here, is there a way to query which version of D3 is being used in Observable? Absolutely. I actually noted it down here. D3 is part of our standard library, so if I enter it into a cell and just write D3, you'll see it's available for me. We don't have to load it into the notebook. It's there by default. And then you can do D3.version to see which version of D3. We're always using the kind of latest version. You can also change that if you like to an older version, but for this course, we're going to be using the latest version of D3. There's also a note here from Karen about observable JavaScript. Yeah, for the most part, when you're working in Observable, you're just using regular vanilla JavaScript. There's a few slight changes that we do to make it work well for notebooks. There's a whole walkthrough of that. We have an Observable JavaScript notebook that talks about those. But essentially, when working within a code block here, you can write any vanilla JavaScript and it's going to work just fine. Yeah, and thank you. There's that link to that notebook. All right, so what we're going to do here to get started is we're going to take some elements from this HTML code and start altering it using D3. So we're going to use that D3 select method. So I'm going to do D3 select, and for now, I'm just going to select that HTML. That's going to allow me to access all the contents of that HTML that I specified here before. If I run this, nothing changes because I'm still just returning that HTML. But now that I've selected the HTML, I can start making changes to it. So we can actually chain methods here, as I did before. I can select that div within the HTML. So now I'm going to just write like that same CSS selector we did before for grabbing that div. And now I can start making changes. Like I can change, like we did before, the style. So that's going to be allowing us to write some CSS. I can change the color to red. And that's going to allow me to, here, oh no, I'm doing something off here. I don't know why it's not changing my color. But here, why don't we stick to the prompts? But that's going to allow me to start changing the values in this cell. So what we're going to do is we're going to select our HTML, and then, oh, I think I know why. I'm actually doing the wrong selector. So I select the P tag and change the style, the color to red. There we go. So just because I was selecting the wrong object. So I can do that same sort of CSS selector and same styling I did before. But what we're going to do is we're select our HTML, and then we're going to use that data method to bind data to our HTML. So I'm going to do select HTML, call the data method here, and then I'm going to add 1, 2, 3. I'm going to add an array of values of 1, 2, 3, and that's going to bind data to this. I'm not sure why I'm getting that here. I'm sorry about that. It's a little odd. So let me here. I'm going to select. Oh, okay. I know what I'm doing. Sorry. It's a very fast session here, so I'm skipping over a few crucial parts. I'm trying to get this all in. I know it's a jam-packed first session. So I select my HTML, and now I wanted to bind data to the objects here. So these 3 different P tags. To do that, though, I need to select those tags within my HTML. So when I select the HTML, I'm actually selecting this div container, and it's got contents within it of these different P tags. So if I want to get those, I'm going to chain methods like I did before to select the contents within there. So I'm going to write select all to get all the different P tags within my HTML, within this div here. So I'm going to write select all, and now I've got all of those. And like I did before, I can change the style for all of them now by writing color, red, and it's going to change the color for all the different P tags within this div container. Now, if I want to bind data to this, now that I've selected all the P tags, I can do that. So I can do data, and that's going to be equal to 1, 2, 3. Now I've bound data to each of these tags. And when I say I bound data, what does that mean? I'm now going to open up actually the JavaScript console here to explain that a little bit more. So if I select one of these here, and again, you can't see my cursor, but if I right-click on this, there's an option in that little window that pops up to inspect it. So I can inspect this, and it's actually going to open up my JavaScript console, which is really big right here, right? I'm going to just adjust this a little bit. And it's showing me that div container. This is all the HTML that's generated that we're seeing on the page. And I can see all those P tags. So I'm going to select the first one here. And when I say data is bound to this object, I can actually see that. So I'm going to write a little code in the JavaScript console here. Do $0 dot underscore d data underscore. And that allows me to see the data that is bound to this object. So there's literally that data property, that one value, it's contained within this element here. So I can then access this for my D3 work. I can access it for setting styles or setting contents, whatever I like, but there's actually data bound to this element. So that's what that data function is doing. It's binding data to these elements here, so then I can use it for other areas. So let's go back up here. So now that I've bound this data, I'm going to then start changing some attributes. So I can do things here. I change the style to red, but maybe I want to change the text, right? I can change the text of this using .text, where D is going to be the contents of the text. So if I do that, you'll see now the context of my text changed from first paragraph, second paragraph, to third paragraph to 1, 2, 3 to be in the contents of my data here. So pretty cool. I can actually now start altering and changing the structure of my HTML using D3. So I selected it. I selected the HTML. I then grabbed all the P tags. I bound data to it. And then I started doing some changes here. So I just kind of set the color for each of them, set to red, but I changed the text value based on the data. We could do more methods here like we did before. So I could filter the results. I could filter this, whereas maybe something like, I'll use the index value. So I'll do maybe something like I is equal to 1. That would select the second object. Maybe do this after I bind my data. So there, I've now filtered the results. where I've just said, all right, after grabbing all my p tags, I only want to get the one where the index is equal to 1, and then I can set specific stylings. I can change the text for that. So all those same methods I did before when I was doing some JavaScript, I can write here as I'm writing my D3 code. All right, we are at the hour. That was a lot today. I know it was a really fast, really jam-packed. We're going to start going through this in a lot more depth tomorrow. Today was really that kind of high-level overview, again, of some of the technologies and frameworks you need to know when working with D3. But we're going to get more in depth on D3, how selections work, how these different functions work tomorrow as we build our first scatter plot. So session 1 is a wrap. Thank you all so much for joining today. This session is recorded and it'll be on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it later if you want to do another pass through it. But again, tomorrow we're going to be talking all about scatter plots and how we build our first one with D3. We're all going to be going through scales, a little bit more about the canvas and how that works, and data joins. So another jam-packed day tomorrow, all getting in more depth on D3. So thank you so much for joining. I appreciate all the questions. Please, if you have more questions, ask them in our community Slack channel. I can follow up with you there and more kind of long form answers. But thank you all again, and I'll see you tomorrow, same time. Yeah, see you then.